Here.
There's some links. This is your size. Yes. This is my size. You are the chair. Good morning, everyone. And before we begin, I'd just like to thank each and everyone for joining us in this session. We will look at the topic, monitoring the SDGs. 3 years in, how are we doing? The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the accompanying Sustainable Development Goals and Targets were adopted 3 years ago in September 2015. Even before the 2030 Agenda was adopted, the United Nations Statistical Commission began to work on developing a monitoring framework to measure progress on achieving these goals and targets. This work was spearheaded by the Interagency and Expert Group on Sustainable Development Goal Indicators, the IAEG SDGs, and they were tasked with developing a global indicator framework. This indicator framework was adopted by ECOSOC and the GA in 2017 and is currently used to monitor progress at the global level on the goals and the targets. Through presentations on the Global Sustainable Development Goals report, an examination of how voluntary national reviews are being used to monitor progress at the national level, and discussion on thematic monitoring, including monitoring undertaken by civil society organizations and the private sector. This session aims to explore both the global indicator framework and other monitoring frameworks and activities that take place at the regional and national levels, and also look at thematic monitoring in an attempt to highlight the different ways progress is being measured and share some of the challenges and achievements over the first 3 years of the 2030 Agenda. The goal of this session is twofold. First, we will highlight how far we, as a global statistical community, have come over the last 3 years in developing these different frameworks to monitor the SDGs, while also highlighting some of the challenges and additional work that still needs to take place. And secondly, highlight some areas of significant progress over the same time period in achieving some of the SDGs and also areas that are lagging behind. It is important to remember that without data to monitor progress on achieving the SDGs, we will never achieve these goals because we will not know what areas and the populations are lagging behind. The duration of this session is 75 minutes. I'm the moderator, Ms. Gatlin Roberts, Chief Statistician of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we will have the following speakers: Ms. Leisha Delatia Bouder from the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, Ms. Gemma Van Halderen, UN ESCAP Statistics Division, Mr. Enrique Ordaz, INEGI, Mexico, and the co-chair of the IAEG SDGs, Mr. Robert Anduga, UN Habitat, and Mr. Clint Brown from ESRI. In this session, each panelist will make brief remarks about efforts in which they are involved to monitor the SDGs, success stories, and the challenges they have encountered. Each panelist will highlight a different type of SDG monitoring, from global monitoring to national and thematic monitoring, and the contributions of the private sector. After the initial interventions, we will have a round-the-table discussion, and then we will have some time at the end for questions and comments from you, our audience. At this time, I will introduce Mr. Enrique Ordaz. He is the co-chair of the IAEG, as I said before. And the IAEG has been at the forefront of developing and implementing the global indicator framework to monitor the SDGs. Mr. Ordaz, what are some of the challenges and the successes you have seen from your work developing and implementing the global indicator framework in the work as co-chair of the IAEG SDGs?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Well, there are several challenges that we have been facing. I would say that to begin with, the IAEG is composed of 28 members of different countries and different regions. And just getting to communicate and to speak the same language has not been an easy task. Of course, we have different backgrounds. We have people from large populated countries as India or China, and then we have small island countries as Jamaica and the Pacific countries, and also we have developed countries, European countries, and we have emerging countries, African countries. So that's one of the first challenges. The second one is that in developing the indicator framework, we began with a set of 304 indicators that were proposed by specialists and experts from different international agencies. And we were asked at the country level about the feasibility, suitability, and relevance of those indicators. That was the first step in developing the framework. And as you just have said, this was approved the Statistical Commission in 2017, and also the General Assembly made a resolution to adopt the Global Indicator Framework. So the challenges are, of course, to review all this set of indicators. We agreed after several meetings, 7 meetings, on 232 indicators. And from those, all of you familiar with this classification, we have 93 indicators for which we have data across the globe, and they are produced regularly. We have 77 indicators for which we have methodology, but not all of the data is being produced. So we need strong efforts in capacity building, and I think that's one of the best of the main challenges we faced. And the other one is to develop methodology for the rest of the indicators. We are talking about 57 indicators which address different goals and targets. And that's a big challenge because we have not been able to produce, and I say we, I mean the international statistical community. And of course, having the motto of leaving no one behind, one of the main issues has to do with data disaggregation, how we are going to identify specific populations in different situations for which we need to develop public policies, private policies as well, and identifying those people in different regions of the world, it's a really big challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Ordaz. We'll now hear from Lisa Delatier.
Thank you, Gatlin. To speak briefly, Jamaica has been participating at multiple levels in the monitoring of the SDGs. Despite our small stature, we have participated at both the regional and international levels, in the sense that we were a member of the interagency and expert group on the SDGs, and we've also been party to the piloting of a number of methodologies for the monitoring of the SDG indicator framework. We are also a part of what is called the CARICOM Technical Working Group on the SDGs, and we support the work of ECLAC on the regional implementation of the monitoring of the SDGs at the regional level. Thank you. So I'll just quickly skip forward. So I'll speak briefly about our institutional mechanism within Jamaica. We did an assessment of the alignment of our National Development Plan with the Sustainable Development Goals with support of the UNDP, and what we found was that there was a 91% alignment between Vision 2030 Jamaica, which was implemented in 2008, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that we are, by implementing our National Development Plan, we are also supporting the work of the Sustainable Development Goals. At the national level, our institutional mechanism comprises the Secretariat for the SDGs, the Secretariat for Vision 2030, our Planning Ministry, various ministries, departments, and agencies, our Foreign Affairs Ministry, and the Statistical Institute of Jamaica through a tripartite arrangement called the 2030 Agenda Core Group, and we jointly work together towards the implementation of the SDGs at the local level. These groups report to various sector committees and also a National Oversight Committee, which is a multi-stakeholder committee, including private sector, civil society, government agencies, youth representatives, and the National Oversight Committee reports to the Parliament. As I said earlier, we have a partnership approach towards the implementation of the SDGs in Jamaica. So we also partner with our international development partners, the public sector, academia, etc. In terms of our integrated framework for the monitoring of the SDGs, we have taken an whole-of-government approach, which means that all ministries, departments, and agencies are required to align their plans and budgets towards the medium-term socioeconomic framework, which is also aligned to the Vision 2030 Jamaica and the SDGs. So within the planning cycle of government, the SDGs is integrated. Additionally, we've taken a whole-of-society approach whereby we have various institutional mechanisms to ensure that the SDGs and Vision 2030 is integrated in the planning cycle at the community level, at the local level. There's also a public investment management system whereby if there is funds coming into the government coffers, then you have to demonstrate how this supports the broader objective of national development. In terms of producing the indicators, the Statistical Institute of Jamaica has led on this in Jamaica, and we will continue to lead. But what we have realized, and this was discussed at this morning's session, is that critical to the monitoring, the effective monitoring of the SDGs is improving the national statistics system. It is important that we strengthen national statistics systems to effectively respond to the data demands of the SDGs, because the NSO by itself will not be able to produce all the required indicators. Additionally, statistical indicators is not the only way that you monitor progress towards achieving the goals. So there also has to be the development of an effective monitoring and evaluation framework for policies and programs to ensure that there is effective monitoring at all levels. There also has to be strategic partnerships. Very quickly, in terms of our process so far, what we did is that we started with an assessment of where we were. So in 2015, we met with the various stakeholders within Jamaica's national statistics system, and we did an assessment to see where we were, what were we able to produce in terms of the indicator framework. Then we began our data collection, and this year we did our voluntary national review report at the UN High-Level Political Forum. We achieved this through a number of things. We looked at our surveys, we reevaluated existing data, there were a number of pilot projects, and there was also training and capacity building. One of the things that has led to much success in terms of where we thought we were in 2016 in terms of the assessment of our ability to produce the indicators, which said that we could only produce around 29%, and where we actually ended up, which was just under 50%, was that we had a lot of partnerships. We had support from our IDPs, we had our ministries, departments, and agencies working together. We were able to incorporate civil society data into our monitoring framework in terms of the production of proxy indicators. And additionally, we had the support from academia. This is just a brief overview of what we're able to produce currently by goals. And as I said earlier, we produced our VNR this year at the UNHLPF. A thing I'd like to point out is that not only were we able to access or mobilize traditional data sources for the production of this year's Voluntary National Review Report, but we also had non-traditional data sources. For example, we used small error estimation to monitor goal 1.2.1, producing poverty estimates at the community level. We also used administrative data for indicator 3.6.1. There was also the use of geospatial information, example indicator 14.5.1, and civil society or NGO data as a proxy for target 14.1. That is the plastic eutrophication index. So in terms of our lessons learned and our next steps, real quickly, SDGs coordination, what we've learned is that is a full-time job. So in terms of monitoring, there has to be support and financing for all areas of delivery of the SDGs. So we have to ensure that, one, we're working together, and also that it is properly financed. Additionally, we have to re-evaluate our approach to disseminating data, to producing data, and we have to ensure that we keep our statistical systems current to ensure that the information is not dated. So in some instances, when we were looking at the indicator framework, we realized that there were certain surveys that had not been done in a number of years, and that this now has to be integrated into our national statistics plans. And finally, as I said before, as a priority, we have to strengthen the national statistics systems. We have to prioritize our development of indicators, because we won't be able to produce all of them at once, so we have to figure out which ones are most important for national development. And of course, there is the need for continuous training and capacity building, improving the MTF, and also disseminating the information. It is important not only to produce it, but also to ensure that it is disseminated and used widely. Thank you.
Thank you, Disha.
Who's next?
We will now have our third speaker, Ms. Gemma Honduras. Ms. Honduras, could you share the regional experience in monitoring the SDGs, given the breadth of information in the 2030 agenda? What have been the key challenges in providing the necessary information to the political debate at the global level?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here at the UN World Data Forum, and it's my first visit to Dubai, and it's a very lovely city, a very lovely part of the world. So I'm going to share the regional perspective for how we are going with the 2030 agenda. My name is Gemma Honduras. I'm responsible for the statistics division in UNSCAP, and so I represent the Asia and Pacific statistical community. So who are we? In Asia and the Pacific, we have 53 member states and 8 associate member states. There are 58 countries in Asia and the Pacific region, and we are a very diverse region. From a population, just in terms of the population lens, we have 6 of the 10 largest countries in the world, starting with China there at about 1.4 billion people, through to, and we also have 4 of the smallest countries in the world. There you see we have Tuvalu with about 11,000. So the region goes from 1.4 billion down to 11,000. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of perspective on this. One of the requirements of the 2030 agenda is to disaggregate data by income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, geography, and anything else the country might be find particularly of interest. So if I just do a two-way, if I just assume that there's two types of income groups, two races, two ethnicity groups, that's 256 types of individual cells. So for a country like Tuvalu and Nauru, who have got 11.5 thousand people, we're talking pretty small cells. And so issues that starts coming up here is not just data availability, but also confidentiality and issues like that. So I just want to give you a perspective. In terms of Asia and the Pacific, the voluntary national reviews are a very good indicator of progress. So in our region in 2016, 5 countries, one of which was Samoa, a small island state in the Pacific, provided voluntary national reviews. In 2017, we had 10 countries. In 2018, we had 7. And this year, in 2019, in July next year, 15 countries will be presenting their voluntary national review. 5 of these are small island states, including Tuvalu and Nauru. And for 3 of these countries, they will be their second national voluntary review. So the voluntary national reviews, I think, have been very good for Asia and the Pacific. The voluntary national reviews have created a new, very important user for official statistics. In many cases, it's the Prime Minister who is presenting this voluntary national report, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this is good for official statistics business. The localising of SDG indicators to your national circumstances, the establishment of coordination committees, the development of national platforms. In the case of linking through to national development strategies, for instance, in the case of Bhutan, they have prioritised 3 of the 17 goals, and their focus is on those 3 goals and targets and indicators within it. It's also building communication skills. So the statistical officers are not only having to produce statistical reports, but they're also having to communicate in a way that is relevant to their key users here, the foreign ministries and the Prime Minister, who then presented at a political forum in New York. So VNRs, I think, are a good process. Now, in terms of the 3 countries they're going to have to repeat, who are doing their second VNR next year, this will bring in some new challenges. For instance, how much progress is being made? And if for many of the indicators, the first voluntary national review may have, for instance, made use of their population census, which is a 10-yearly collection. So if they're going to do a repeat voluntary national report 3 years after the first one, what will be their indicator source? And how will they present progress? So this is a new challenge, I think, that for many countries. The 2030 agenda is actually a global agenda and a national agenda. At the regional level, such as Asia and the Pacific, this is not the focus. However, we are preparing reports to bring some focus. This here is a page out of a SCAP report from last year that presented 16 of the goals and used data that was available. At the global level, my understanding is about 50% of the indicators have data available. In Asia and the Pacific, a regionally comparable report could only use about 20% we had indicators for, many of which were proxies. And this brought in the issue of the use of non-official data sources. And this is an emerging issue for many of the chief statisticians in our region, the use of non-official statistics in an official report. The second issue which is being raised is how do we measure progress? For the Millennium Development Goal era, there was some progress processes put in place, like MDG Watch. So increasingly we're being asked, how do you measure progress, not only at the country level, but at the region and global level? The third issue is a multitude of reports are being produced on how well are we as a nation progressing, how well are we as a region, and how well are we as a country progressing. And for instance, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network have recently produced a report on progress with 2030. And the issue here is, are we all getting a very coherent story or not? Recently, I was joined the other chief statisticians from the UN system, and UNCTAD, Steve McFeely, put together this summary table here. What it's showing is that over the last 15 months, the number of Tier 1 agreed methodology indicators has gone from 35% to 40%, 5 percentage points. The number of Tier 3 indicators with agreed methodologies gone from 38 to 27%, 11 percentage points. So the question here, and many of the countries in my region, in Asia Pacific, are looking for global guidance. What is the best methodology to use for these indicators? And here we are 15 months on, and we're still looking for 27% of the global indicators still do not have an agreed methodology. And even in the Tier 1 methodology, I heard last week that some of the Tier 1 methodologies, the agreed methodology is to use what's appropriate for your national circumstances, and countries are looking for some guidance on that. So to summarise, the 3 years on, I think the Agenda 2030 has definitely strengthened national statistical systems. Chief statisticians working closely with their Prime Minister's Department, Foreign Affairs Ministry to strengthen the role of official statistics. It's bringing skills in reporting platforms. It's providing a new role, a strengthened role for national statistical officers and chief statisticians, and it's producing a lot of very, very positive user-producer dialogues. What are some of the opportunities? Strengthen public-private partnerships. How do we measure progress? How do we have regard to the fundamental principles of official statistics? Agenda 2030, governments have agreed to producing global statistics, having regard to the fundamental principles. How do we do that? As well as skills development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Valhanderen. We will now hear from Mr. Robert Nduga of UN Habitat. Another important type of monitoring for the 2030 agenda is thematic monitoring. Mr. Nduga, what do you see as the main role of thematic monitoring of the SDGs, and how does it complement the reporting of at the global and national level?
Thank you, moderator. Good morning to you all. My name's Robert Ndugwa, the current chief for the Data and Statistics Unit at UN Habitat. And just to start off the conversation, I think it's always good to acknowledge that our world is becoming largely urban, and today you might find out that literally all the participants who are attending this conference do come from a city or at least an urban area as a measure to show how fast urbanizing we are. And the issue of urban and cities has also been fully recognized in quite a number of various global agendas, especially in the era of the post-2015 MDGs. And we see this in the Sustainable Development Goals with a specialized Goal 11 that focuses on human settlements as well as cities. But we've also seen it in the new urban agenda that was passed in 2016. And all the other global agendas from the Paris Agreement still have something that lends itself to the issue of urban. And what we see is that the challenges that cities do face, ranging from poverty, unemployment, issues to do with urban mobility, these are all issues that cities are facing, but cities are also the centers of innovations, and therefore they do have a key role to play in terms of addressing these specific challenges. So while we see challenges, we see wonderful opportunities. And within Goal 11, there are 10 targets. We see these as very wonderful opportunities to address the issues that cities are currently facing. And these range from target 11.1 on housing all the way to the policy-oriented targets that run from 11A to 11C. And the issue here is looking at all these as wonderful opportunities, it's always challenging to make sense of it. But it's also challenging to monitor many of them. And we've seen some of these challenges that until today, you do have mechanisms of reporting. And annually, for example, as we've had, we have various mechanisms of reporting. We have the Secretary General's report, which shows in short stories how much progress has been made. But this usually focuses on the Tier 1s and Tier 2 indicators. We also have the Regional Commission reports, as Gemma has just presented. But we also have the country-specific reports, which are the VNRs, as we've had this morning. And there is also one opportunity that was opened up and offered, and that's the opportunity to provide thematic reviews and thematic reports, something that digs deeper on a specific subject matter. And we are lucky that this year in 2018, during the high-level political forum, which focused on transformation of our societies, we succeeded to produce the first synthesis report on SDG 11. And this was a thematic report profiling the challenges of urban, and it specifically looked at the issues in terms of interlinkages between the various global agendas, but also the interlinkages between the targets themselves and the targets across. Of course, keeping in mind that urban and the issue of cities, these are cross-cutting, and therefore they do apply to so many other global agendas as well as other goals within the SDGs. But we also looked at the challenges in terms of methodologies and how those have been addressed, or where some gaps are missing, the capacity development issues, the partnerships arrangements, but also the institutional mechanisms as we've had. And the issue that really, I think, was a big major finding for us was the fact that urban is not only cross-cutting, but many of the targets that sit in Goal 11, they need a partnership arrangement that applies at the local level, which means cities or local governments, as well as at the national level, and cascading that all the way to the global level. And therefore, addressing these issues requires a different mechanism that has never been in place before in terms of partnerships. The other aspect was on mainstreaming, especially the key focus areas of issues of gender, or issues of youth, or issues of culture, which is also critically and very important when it comes to cities. So through this specific report, we're able to produce at least something that goes beyond what the VNRs offer or what the global reports at the Secretary General's levels offers. And one of the issues we found was that in terms of strengthening capacities, there's a lot of coordination that is required, but there's also a lot of support in terms of financing from the methodology point of view, but also the investments. As we'll hear later, GIS or the geospatial technologies are critical in monitoring the urban issues. And therefore, we need partnerships, but as well as funding. And we were able to examine, for example, opportunities of how to hasten and fasten the processes of producing this urban data. And we see that technology will play a critical role in addition to all the other existing mechanisms. So in essence, the new strategic partnerships that we require to succeed in delivering and monitoring all these global targets that are available at the urban level requires a mechanism of so many issues. And I just want to highlight a few issues here. And one of those is that governments, for example, need to work together, from the local governments to national governments to global institutions, given the fact that a lot of the urban issues play out at the local government levels. We've also been able to, as I summarize, we've been able to look at one very important aspect, and that's the truth that we are monitoring for the first time urban data at the unit called a city. And one of the challenges with that is that we need a global definition for what a city is, independent from urban areas and independent from the rural areas. And we do welcome, I think, the processes of producing these thematic reports, because they go a little mile and a little further to at least highlight some of the challenges that some of the SDG indicators might face, which is usually not profiled in any other regular reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. We now have our final speaker, Mr. Clint Brown of ESRI. In order to successfully monitor the SDGs, it will be necessary to incorporate data from the private sector and other new data sources. ESRI has been working on web GIS portals like www.sdg.org that integrate and organize access to multiple geospatial information and satellite imagery. And Mr. Brown, can you talk a little bit about this work on the web GIS and the challenges and opportunities for NSOs and governments to apply these new systems for SDG monitoring? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. A little bit about ESRI. We have a large customer base. Many of you in the audience are some of our customers. Many others also use GIS in various forms. So there's a role that private industry plays, but it's interesting to note that our customer base is over half of our customers worldwide work in some government capacity. Many work in NGOs and volunteer organizations, including the UN, including organizations like the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. And I think some of the discussion today has been really interesting to look at the progress and the work ahead. And I think one of the things that we haven't talked about up here today is the role that GIS and maps play in being able to both understand information but also to communicate information. After all, I think one of our goals is to reach our populations and our people and to kind of gain their participation and interest in what's going on. Some things have been happening in the area of GIS where community GIS is starting to emerge with the new web and cloud platforms where hubs of communities gather together around various initiatives. You could think about each of the Sustainable Development Goals as an initiative, and GIS provides a kind of framework for working on those initiatives, for measuring against those initiatives, and for understanding and ultimately taking action on those initiatives. And it really, I thought I just would take a few minutes and explain a little bit about some of the concepts at a real high level about what I mean when I talk about a web GIS. And the first is that a GIS exists for a reason. It has a purpose, and there's no higher purpose than the global goals for sustainable development, and building a system for that is very interesting. The UN and many countries, including FCSA here in the Emirates, have begun to work on these systems and to implement these systems. And what these are is they're collections of individual data sets. And if you think about a GIS, it's really interesting. They're layers of information that integrate geographically in space. Those layers of information are used to assemble maps. Maps these days online, we all use them to route ourselves and to look at our environment and so on. But what's very interesting about a map is a few things when it's online. One of the things it is it's an app. And apps have real specific purposes and real specific audiences. So maps have this really interesting role to play as a vessel for delivering reports and also for understanding our status on each sustainable development goal. Those maps and apps are collected in a system along with the data sets. The data sets are used to make layers in those maps. And one of the other things about a web system is the web systems have an actual catalog, kind of a table of contents of the information for what are in those systems. And of course, the idea behind a web GIS, a community, is there's people, there's an audience of people that are ready to use that information and to put it to work. And I would say one of the key things about maps that's been discovered in the past close to 15 years now is maps on the web are kind of universally appreciated as a way to deliver pretty massive amounts of information, but to understand them and to be able to gain insight from the display of that information and the ability to integrate different variables or different themes of information to gain a little bit of deeper insight. These online maps are also tools that you can use to do analytics against and to work with the results. So we think the geospatial community has a very important role to play in the development of systems for sustainable development. And that's basically the idea. So if you look at a modern GIS, you'll see lots of data layers about all kinds of thematic categories organized together. For example, in the Living Atlas that's part of ArcGIS Online, there are maps, global maps for ecological land units. There are global maps, 3D in nature and 4D in nature, that are about ecological marine units that integrate and synthesize data from all over the world. And those data come to life as maps. Every map is an app. Every map has a purpose and an audience, and those maps are easy to build now. Everybody can build them. These days in our community, every single day, over a billion and a half maps are made by our customer base. This isn't Google or anything like that, but it's just trying to indicate that the technology platform that's being created by the broad GIS community and their data sets, much of which come from the statistical agencies of the world. So your good work comes to life in these GISs and needs to be a part of those systems. And these apps bring those maps and information to life for interested users, for decision makers, for people that can act on and do something about that information. That information's organized into the catalog, this shared portal that enable all of us, every citizen even, to be able to access information that's appropriate to be shared with them, as well as decision makers and so on. And that leads to us being able to create GIS systems that are community-based systems, shared systems that we can work together both at the national and subnational levels, as well as rolling those up and synthesizing those into global perspectives about what we do with GIS. So I would just close by saying our goal at ESRI and our partners and many of the companies that are here this week are very interested and committed to helping you achieve your work and your agenda for sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. We have heard from all of our panelists, a very disciplined team of panelists, everyone staying within their time limits. So I will now pose a question to the entire panel. A key component of the agenda is the principle of leaving no one behind. This means that data need to be disaggregated. From each of your positions, how do you see the work on data disaggregation progressing and what more needs to be done? So we will go in the same order we started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as I said before, data disaggregation is one of the main challenges that we face. And within the IAG, we have established a work stream with a group of countries. This group is led by Ghana and Germany. Previously, Jamaica was part of that working group. And the idea is to construct a matrix showing the dimensions and categories that are used by agencies and other experts. So the idea is not to start from scratch, but to borrow from the best practices from different organizations. So the IAG will submit a background paper to the Statistical Commission in 2019 with the dimensions and categories of data disaggregation. And one aspect which is very important concerns resources and costs. Most of the countries rely on household surveys to produce the data. And one major challenge within this segregation is that of the use of administrative records. If we could have access to very well organized and accessible administrative records, it would be easier to identify different population groups. However, in most emerging countries, at least in Mexico, I can speak about, we have a big challenge in organizing all these administrative records, which would provide better tool for disaggregating data so that we cannot spend so much money in large sample surveys, which would be impossible to take on a regular basis. Probably the other source of data would be the population census, but it's a decennial census, so we would have really a few points in time to follow up on the disaggregation. So I think the statistical community and being here at the World Data Forum, it's a good opportunity to find ways on how to address this issue of data disaggregation. Thank you.
Thank you. From our perspective, data disaggregation is a very complex process, particularly for small states such as Jamaica. The issue that we are faced with as a national statistics system is balancing the need for data to be disaggregated to ensure that we leave no one behind and confidentiality. So that's a significant challenge that we are constantly grappling with. For example, there are certain groups that if you try to capture information on them through a survey, the number of respondents would be so small that you cannot report on it. So this is a constant challenge that we have been faced with. The thing, though, is for us to innovate, to look at new sources, such as admin data, as Enrique said earlier. But the issue is that this admin data has to be organized in such a way that it can be used for statistical purposes. Because if we're going to be disaggregating data, it will require larger sample sizes, and that would just not be practical. So from our perspective, it is important, but it's a major challenge. And it is something that the statistical community, I'm sure as a whole, is grappling with at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity of sitting on a panel with the co-chair of the IEAG expert group on SDGs to give a slightly different take on the phrase "leave no one behind," and sort of talk about leaving no country behind in the process of developing the methodology for these indicators. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a very vast number of countries in Asia Pacific, and in particular we have some very small countries in the Pacific, but we also have some very developing nations in Asia itself. And so from a methodological point of view, we need to make sure that if we're producing methodologies for Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 indicators, that the global statistical community is equipped to be able to produce these statistics. Methodologies need to be doable at the national level, and even though we might want to have some advanced methodologies, I think we need to make sure that national statistical officers or national circumstances allow the production of those indicators. And this is where I think partnerships with companies like ESRI are really very important, because the geospatial community can work with the official statistics community of how do we develop methodologies to produce these indicators, and also the partnerships with global partners such as UN Habitat, UNEP, who also have a good understanding of what are some of the data sources and methodologies that we can produce and develop to be able to meet the global indicator. So I didn't want to talk about data disaggregation. I just wanted to say let's leave no country behind as we develop the methodologies. Thank you.
Thank you. I think our take is, again, very complementary to what I think the other panelists have noted. And the interesting bit when it comes to the leaving no one behind principle is that at UN Habitat, we also believe in leaving no spaces behind. And that translates into the need to understand what are some of those spaces. What are those vulnerable spaces? What are those deprived spaces? And we're working with quite a number of partners, including ESRI and all our other regional commissions, at least to be able to map out, in the context of leaving no one behind, what are those spaces that are more critical, that are more at risk in terms of being left behind, and narrowing down the resources and the support to those specific areas so that these ones can be well reported and also very well monitored. And what we've done as part of the analysis at UN Habitat will show you that the most deprived areas are the ones that lack a lot of data. And therefore, for this to be reflected in a lot of our global frameworks and indicators and reports, we need to ensure that we put a more enhanced lens on what is happening in those specific spaces. So in addition to all the other disaggregation levels that are available, which we believe in strongly, we do believe the spatial component is also a critical component that needs to be focused on.
Thank you.
It's very interesting. Robert and I were talking backstage about his participation in some of the work in the response to Ebola back in, I think, 2014. You guys may remember about this time in 2014, there was a projection that the number of deaths was going to go way above 1 million. And it was the World Health Organization and the statistical communities that responded. The reason why this is interesting to me is this idea of leaving no one behind sometimes requires us to take novel approaches and to find new ways to gather information and then to act on that information. The World Health Organization had an amazing public health protocol that they needed to implement based upon where people were dying. They were using GIS to do novel methods to get out to the field, to collect data to respond to that, and miraculously, they turned this projected curve of deaths, just dipped. During winter time, like February, it just started going the other direction because of your good work, people like you working together to find new and novel ways. And the reason why I bring it up is sometimes I think, how do we get creative and think clearly about opportunities to try new approaches and to experiment with ideas in ways that we can really measure that against the risk of what we do with that information and how we act on it. I think it's one of the untold or kind of undertold stories of success in the past decade that's really interesting about leaving no one behind.
We will now invite questions from the floor. Yes? What is the procedure for this?
We have 1 minute.
Thank you for interesting presentations. I'm from Azerbaijan State Statistical Committee. I have questions to new data sources. How we assess risk of use of these new data sources? Risk of usage of new data sources, such as big data, administrative data, or geospatial data. Any risk assessment of aspects of the new sources?
Okay.
We don't have much time, but I can try. When we speak about big data, there are different kinds of big data. So in the case of unstructured big data, I think the problem it has to do with quality and the ability to have a good exploitation of those data. In the case of a more structured data like that from firms or telephone companies, one risk in relying on those data is that is not very easy accessible, or it has a cost. In the case of geospatial information, I think that's a very important source. At the IAEG, we have established a working group on geospatial information that will support all of the development of the SDG indicators and implementation. But having said that, I think that it's important for national statistical offices in partnership with private firms and with civil society to address the issue of news data sources. And I know we're finished, but another important source are surveys that deal with perceptions. National statistical offices, many of them are very conservative, and they don't like collecting data that is subjective. However, some of the indicators and targets deal with perceptions, and we have to come to terms with these new ways of collecting data and new forms to address existing issues. So I'm sorry.
If I could just quickly add, though, as statisticians, even with traditional data sources, it is our responsibility to first analyze and assess the quality of the data that you're going to be using. So it is not that we're saying that you're just going to take the data and use it and compile indicators. You have to assess whether or not it is reliable, whether it's consistent, and how robust are the indicators that you are producing based on this data. So there are many ways to assess it. Some of it will require, for example, with admin data, it will require greater partnerships between the NSO and the agency producing the administrative data. So partnerships are important to ensure that the data is robust, to ensure that it gives you what you need, and to ensure that you can produce in a consistent way the data the indicators that are required.
Thank you, Lisha. We are out of time. I'm sorry if we had any more questions, but we are out of time, and so I would just want to thank our panelists for sharing with us, and to thank you, the audience, for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.